This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Anatolian Dispatch. Today's guest is Dr. Chris Kilford, who's retired from 30 plus years of service with the Canadian Defence Forces. For us, the most pertinent thing is that for a number of years, he was the Defence Attache of Canada in Ankara, Turkey, with also dual accreditation to a number of neighboring countries, among which was Azerbaijan, which of course is of interest. But today we're going to kind of focus on what Turkey is up to in its near abroad, and then maybe a couple of countries in the not so near abroad that Turkey has shown an interest in and involvement in over the last year, and where that might be going, and what impact it might have on the 2023 elections, and the role of the United States and others in helping to maintain some stability, or at least a modicum of stability in the Middle East. So with that, Chris, over to you. Syria. All right.
Victoria and Syria. You know, we were chatting before we went live here, and there seems to be a never-ending number of issues that you can talk about when it comes to Turkey, whether it's Turkey and Libya, Turkey and Syria, Azerbaijan, and the list goes on. And then all of the internal challenges that we watch on a daily basis. I think when we were talking earlier on, the point that I wanted to make was how important the American presence is in Syria. And it's only, as we know, it's only 900 troops. But
right.
When you look on the map, the 900, if you like, are positioned in a very strategic spot in eastern Syria. And if you look on the map, you can see Ankara in one direction, Tehran in the other, Baghdad in the other, and then finally Damascus, and there they are sitting right in the middle. And I looking at that, you quickly realize that they are preventing a regional meltdown that would, of course, draw in Turkey even more than it is now, and partly also preventing that regional meltdown is the Russian presence in Syria, which can't be discounted. Right. So working in tandem, whether they mean to or not, Russia and the United States are preventing a meltdown in the area, akin to what we saw with the rise of the Islamic State and everything that meant. And what also struck me as I was looking at this, of course, is where will this situation eventually go? How long will, let's call them the 900 Americans, the 900 be in Syria? Because I can't think of any good outcome from all of this as I look at that situation there. So if you look at the American presence, there's a long list of things that they are preventing, if you like, besides I call it a regional meltdown. But right. The thing is, they are preventing Iran's influence in the region from expanding all the way through to Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're preventing the shipment of weapons. They're preventing the Islamic State from regenerating. They're preventing Syria from having access to the oil from the Al Omar fields and having the money in their hands, of course, preventing the government from latching onto the agricultural resources and the money that comes with that as well. One of the things, though, that I haven't really seen a lot of people speak about is they're actually preventing terrorism inside Turkey. And what I mean by that is they're, of course, supporting the SDF, the YPG, which, of course, Turkey considers to be nothing more than the PKK. But the YPG also, realizes is that if that 900 troop count from the Americans is going to stay in eastern Syria, what they can't do in Turkey is start creating problems, because
Right.
that will give the Turks ample reason to say to the Americans, you know, look, you guys are, we keep telling you you're supporting a terrorist organization. You don't listen. But look at what's happening inside Turkey right now. They're bombing places. They're assassinating people. The fighting is like it was during the sort of 2015 period, and then, you know, perhaps during the 1990s and so forth. And you guys are actively contributing to that. So the PKK are very clever about this. They've kept a very low profile because they know that to raise the profile would create problems in Syria, and probably the Americans deciding to head home. So it's kind of ironic in a way. You know, Turkey's yelling at the Americans because they're supporting the YPG in Syria, but at the same time, actually, it's dampening down the situation in Turkey, because the YPG know that they shouldn't be launching attacks at this time. It wouldn't be a good strategy for their long-term you know, survivability. So all of this is sort of rolling around in the region, and I really don't see how things are going to change, because when you layer on Syria right now, if you layer on it the Syrian government checkpoints, the Iranian-backed militia checkpoints, the Hezbollah checkpoints, the groups that Turkey supports, and the Turkish checkpoints, you start the Russian checkpoint, you start layering them. There's you wonder sometimes how you actually get down a road in Syria without being stopped every 3 kilometers by some particular group. Where is this all actually going to go? And I would say, as I come back to when I started, the status quo, are we going to be stuck with the status quo? Well, maybe the US is helping dampen down the violence. That's really important. The Russians are also helping as well. If they were both to leave, it would be a mess, absolute mess. So, yeah, here we are, right? Let's just come back to one thing. It's fine for the US, of course. They're leaving from Afghanistan. They're talking about leaving from Iraq, but don't forget, we do have the NATO mission in Iraq as well. But I really, really do believe if they were to leave from Syria, we would have a catastrophe on our hands.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to understand. I mean, you know, Afghanistan is really far away from the United States, and it's almost impossible to find even pretty well-informed Americans who see much sense for the United States maintaining a presence there. Now, and in fact, all the arguments about a continued US presence in Afghanistan have been about maintaining a small enabling force to support NATO or to support the Afghan army, but to not actually be engaged in any way in military operations, which is very much like, so, but that's now totally off the table because everything's off the table. But in Iraq, that is where we're headed, that the United States will become supportive of the NATO mission. Now, you and I have both worked closely with US military personnel, some of whom chafe under the idea of actually working in an almost subordinate role with anyone other than a US commanding officer. So it can get ticklish when you try to have them supporting a NATO mission rather than running a NATO mission. But we'll see how Iraq pans out. I think, in fact, there is going to be some sort of continuing presence of the US military in Iraq, but again, in a supportive role towards the Iraqi forces and NATO. Syria is very interesting because, of course, you know, US forces inside a NATO mission at the invitation of the Iraqi government in Iraq is one thing, but US forces in Syria, directly contrary to the wishes of the Assad regime and also some other players in the region. I mean, do a little speculation here. You mentioned the Russians. I mean, how are the Russians going to feel if tomorrow President Biden announces our 900 guys are leaving and they should be out within a week? Speculate a little bit. Well, how would the Russians take that? As an opportunity, or as this is worse for us?
Yeah. So, okay. So first of all, the United States are not the only uninvited foreign troops in Syria.
Right.
I think the government in Damascus would point to the Turks and say, you're uninvited as well. And I think also if you were to move over to Baghdad, the Iraqi government would also say the Turks that occupy or have bases in northern Iraq are uninvited and should go home as well. Right. So we have a lot of uninvited foreign forces in the region. But I think if the Americans were to leave, it's possible that the Kurdish group in the east would have to come to some agreement with the government. I mean, we know even during the darkest days of the fighting that there were all sorts of relationships that were ongoing between the government in Damascus and the SDF. I mean, they understand the situation, and I think that there would be some kind of resolution there that would take place. And it would allow, of course, maybe the Russians to set up some additional bases and whatnot. But it still would not deal with the larger issues, of course, which is the presence of Turkey and of the opposition groups that you have still in various cities and Idlib and whatnot, which I think would be of the main concern. But once the situation, let's say for the Kurds in Syria, might calm down and they do come to some agreement with Assad, you can easily see or speculate, let's say, on how things might go from there, where the Kurds in Syria now feel that they can turn their attention to or back to Turkey with the tacit backing of the Assad regime as payback for all of the grief that Turkey has caused the Damascus government. And you go back to a situation like we had in the 90s when the Syrians, when the PKK had bases in Syria. I mean, this is the way things play out in the region. People look for their opportunities. So you can imagine Bashar al-Assad saying to the Kurds in Syria, look, okay, you don't cause me any trouble. I won't cause you any trouble. And then, of course, then the Kurds in Syria say, well, maybe it's time to turn our attention back to Turkey and start extracting a price. And it will be part maybe of a larger Syrian strategy to get the Turks to withdraw from the areas that they currently occupy. I mean, look, this is a bit of speculation, that is for sure. But, for those that watch the region, these are how things play out. It doesn't all happen tomorrow. It can sometimes take a few years for these things to work themselves out. And then, of course, what it means for Turkey is for the United States, they're not there any longer, but who's helping to tackle the Islamic State? Maybe it's in somebody's interests to allow them to create problems for the government in Iraq, so you see all of these little potentials coming out. And then, of course, you've got a NATO member, which is Turkey, having to now deal with a fresh round of fighting in the southeast, which drains resources and so on, and creates problems for the government in Ankara when they can least afford to have those sorts of problems right now. So there we go. This is what could happen in the absence of the American presence. But what does it mean that you tell Washington, for example, that they need to stay there for the next 50 or 60 years? Well, look, when you do look around the region, you see, for example, Cyprus has been divided since 1964. That's 57 years. Israel and Palestine, there's no resolution in sight there. Some of these conflicts in that particular region, and we can reflect on Azerbaijan and Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, South Ossetia in Georgia and Abkhazia. Some of these issues, these conflicts, whatever, they have been going on for half a century. And this is what people involved in this particular region are facing when they do decide to get involved.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point. I mean, there's a tendency for many policymakers and for, let's just say, recently elected politicians to believe that they're going to bring a new vision to the situation, and it will make all the difference. And 6 months from now, we'll all be standing up and cheering the, the dramatic changes that have taken place. And I'll give you an example of that. In a sense, in the reverse, Jared Kushner and a bunch of some other people worked to get formal recognition of Israel by a number of Arab states, majority Muslim states, Arab states. That did not occur in 6 months. Now, the truth of the matter is there had already been things going on in the previous administration, but it took literally 3 years of effort by Jared Kushner and a bunch of support people from both state and the White House National Security Office and all that. And yet, as dramatic as it was to have the Abraham Accords, what on the ground has significantly changed in the Middle East? Yes, there are flights between Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv, which none of this is bad. All of this is good. Although the Palestinians might disagree with that, since it hasn't improved our situation. It hasn't radically improved the situation of Israel with, many other countries. We seem to have this tendency, but I think particularly in the United States, to say, oh well, we have 6 months to get this all done. Well,
yeah, as
you point out, instability in Cyprus and the conflict, the intercommunal conflict between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots goes to 1964, when the UN arrived to try to maintain some peace between the two communities, and then in 74 the invasion. I mean, it's just been that way for decades. And I think in some ways maybe this is where Syria, who knows? I mean, but I could imagine that 5 years hence we're still talking about very much the same situation in Syria.
Yeah, we could. And I think when I look at what was achieved under the Trump administration with various, people reaching out to Israel and the establishment of relations and stuff like that, it's easy to be cynical about it. But as I think Churchill said, it's better to jaw than war or something like that.
Yep. And
it's warts and all a tiny step forward, and potentially for others in the region, it might open a way for them to reach out. The Arab Street, of course, has a different opinion about Israel than some of their governments do, but it's better in a region where there are few successes when it comes to regional security. Even the smallest things that we see, like what was achieved with Kushner and all that. That's great. And I'm aware. I'm mindful there's a regional security conference set for Baghdad at the end of the month, and the French will be there and others will be there. I can't imagine that you could get through that particular agenda in half a day. You'd need I think you'd need to set aside a week, but we'll see what comes out of that, because within the region, we know Lebanon is failing. We have the Iran nuclear deal that needs to be talked about. Even if we look wider and we look at Libya, you can see right now the Turkish government is involved in troop rotations of Syrian mercenaries, bringing in fresh legs, taking out those that have been there for a while, and it's an ongoing thing. And with the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimating that there are 7,000 Syrian mercenaries in Libya, the rotation of them is a major undertaking for for what I would consider to be, the Turkish intelligence services and the military involved in that. There's so much to discuss within that particular region. So it's good to see. I'm not particularly feel optimistic that anything will be resolved, but best to get people together and talk about these things, because at the moment, some of the resolution, the outcomes of some of these conflicts, I just don't know where they're going to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I mean, my main point is that unfortunately in the United States, and this has something to do with our election cycles. It has to do with how divided we have become. It used to be said that in the United States, foreign policy conflicts, political conflicts, ended at the borders, in the sense that the foreign policy was very bipartisan. Well, that hasn't actually ever been as true as people would like to believe. I mean, it's just historically not true. Foreign policy issues have always been somewhat divisive in America. But
and the same here, Ed, for sure.
Yeah, and by the way, it's kind of worth noting that in Turkey, there seems to be much more consensus about foreign policy issues. I mean, there are some, obviously, people do not want their sons to die fighting in Syria. And yet, so we can talk about the fact that you mentioned the mercenaries.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. From a purely ruthless calculation, it is always wise for a sultan, king, emperor, president, whoever, to use foreign mercenaries in an overseas adventure than his own citizens, because politically it's not as costly. And that's, I know that sounds incredibly cynical, but it is the reality. And I think, one of the reasons I believe that, outside of the PKK, the other military things that Turkey is doing have not been costly to Erdogan is because in some cases, many Turks are very proud of the fact that he is using both soft power and a little bit of hard power to enhance Turkey's image, at least as they see it and as he sees it. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the price in the lives of Turkish military personnel has been relatively low, and in part because they've been using Syrian mercenaries in Libya. There's all sorts of speculation about, were they also using some sort of foreign fighters, both in Syria and, for the short period of time they were working in Azerbaijan. I don't know about that latter case, but yeah,
yeah, it serves multiple purposes though, doesn't it, Ed? Because if you're sitting in Ankara, first of all, you've got all of these Syrian opposition groups that you've armed and trained and are currently sitting around doing nothing. And that's the last thing you want, because that will just create trouble for you that you don't necessarily need right now. So it's very handy to then have a conflict in the region that you can start sending them to so that they can let off a bit of steam, if you like. At the same time, as you say, you don't have to deploy the Turkish military, which would seem to be, it would be very overt if Turkish troops were appearing in the region. Turkey takes a lot of flack already with their base in Qatar, right. And there's accusing them of sort of neo-Ottomanistic designs on the region. So if you have a few Turkish ships and some airplanes dropping off people and whatnot in Libya, then that would be okay. But to have a big Turkish military presence there, it would not play out well. At the same time, people need to realize that the Turkish military actually isn't that large, which will come as a shock to all of those people that are quick to say that Turkey has the second largest military in NATO. And of course, it is a large military, but as we know, the bulk of it is made up of young men who just serve for 6 months. They barely have time to get a uniform out of the kit stores and get it on, and maybe get to fire their rifle a little bit, if at all, and then they're sent home and another batch is showing up. So what you're left with is actually a pretty small force, given the span of issues that the military has to contend with large numbers being deployed in the southeast on a daily basis, and then having the issues that we know about in northern Iraq and so on. So you don't have that many troops left. So that's actually quite handy. It serves a number of purposes for the Turkish government.
Right, and it also serves a domestic political purpose, because as I know from dealing extensively with Latin American militaries, the best place for your senior colonels and just promoted brigadiers is overseas. You don't want them hanging around with not much to do.
Yeah. And you mentioned political, differences of political opinion within Turkey, and this is something we've spoken about before. And I've mentioned that, my view, Turkey's on a perpetual war footing,
right?
And Turkish politicians have said many times that they're involved in a war with the PKK. They're involved in what is a near war in their own backyard, close to Ankara, with the Gulen movement. And so when a country is on a war footing, whether it's declared or not, there's no room for journalistic freedom. There's very little room for political freedom. And it's a minefield for political parties that might, for example, say, we should get out of Iraq, like the US is. Can you imagine if the CHP said, we should get out of Iraq, we should stop hunting down the PKK, or get out of Syria, or we should bring back Ataturk, and he'll tell us to keep to ourselves and stay out of this region. It's not in our best interests. There's no room for this kind of discussion to take place without being labeled a terrorist, without losing your parliamentary immunity. So it creates a lose-lose situation in the realm of Turkish politics. They put themselves into this position, and there's no real way out. And one of the things that I'm noticing more and more, because what this regional instability has done for Turkey is it's brought to them, as you and your listeners will well know, millions of refugees. Yeah. And now, of course, they're concerned about what might happen as Afghanistan begins to get into a deeper and deeper hole, and more Afghans start showing up in Turkey. And where do we go from here? And what I'm seeing more and more amongst Turks is that there were already concerns with Syrian refugees about the fact that they were taking the low-paying jobs. They were not integrating, and of course, that they weren't helped by the way the Turkish government was handling the whole integration issue. That seems to be changing a little bit now. But it's this discussion that's taking place on the impact on Turkey's national identity. This is something that Turks are discussing now, because they see, for example, that the Kurdish Turkish population has far more children per couple than sort of secularized, westernized, or even religious conservative Turks they're having just far less children than their Turkish Kurdish counterparts. And now they're looking at the high birth rates of Syrian refugees within their country, and the influx of more refugees from the region. And they're starting to question themselves, especially if you're sitting in Hatay or along the border, about, where are things going? You hear Turkish politicians in Hatay and other places saying that if the government was to give citizenship to all of these folks, that you would have Syrians in charge of the local governments along the border and border provinces and so forth. It's changing the very makeup. And I think for Turkey, it's a real challenge. For countries like Canada, where we will start accepting up to 400,000 people every year. And we've been doing that for a very long time in smaller numbers, but it's growing. Yes, there's a Canadian national identity. It's built around hockey and Tim Hortons coffee shops and stuff.
A double-double.
A double-double. I mean, there's it's sometimes hard to put a finger on, but we kind of know what it is, and we're happy to accept everybody from around the world. And it's sometimes challenging, but we work our way through it. But for Turkey, I think it's, look, historically, Turkey has had influxes of immigrants from the Balkans and other places as population exchanges occurred. But this is a kind of a newish phenomena since the involvement in Syria in the last 10 years. And now it's just picking up steam. And I think for a lot of Turks, they're starting to get a little worried. And it does not portend well for the AK Party. Not only do they have fires to deal with, not only do they have rising inflation, not only people are angry about many things, and of course they're worried about where Turkey's heading because of all of this involvement in the region. So, lots and lots to talk about as we head towards elections in 2023.
Yeah, I mean, and I think all of this information about what they're doing in Syria. Then we have the other places. I mean, there's not enough time to do it today. This is going to be ongoing, and all of this clearly is building up to 2023. Some people say, "Oh, well, that's 2 years away." No, I mean, clearly the people who run the AK Party are concerned about what are their chances of being able to maintain a parliamentary majority and to win the presidency. Now, the presidency, of course, a lot of that is going to depend on, is there a really strong, viable candidate from the opposition? And if that person comes out of the woodwork, or if that person is actually already on the landscape and he's identified or she is identified, although I think it's probably almost certain that given the way where Turkey is, it's going to be a he. But, the opposition parties, I mean, you mentioned the fact that, they're obviously not going to, speak about leaving Iraq, not battling the PKK and all that sort of stuff. But they do have a number of arguments that are going to help them. And the AK Party, I think, probably is a little nervous. Now, some people think that it's easy to speculate. Let me change that. It's easy to speculate that much of what Erdogan has done outside of Turkey's border was to distract people from the problems they have within Turkey. I don't think that's the case at all. I believe that Erdogan saw opportunities in some cases, but in other cases he saw a need to blunt a problem that they were facing, and that I mean Syria. I mean, you mentioned the refugees. Well, how many of us now believe that those 5 million or so Syrian refugees, plus their children, so who knows what the real number is by now, 5.5 million? Those Syrian Arabic-speaking refugees in Turkey are going back to Syria anytime soon. That's about as likely as the Palestinians from the West Bank who have been living in Jordan for the last 70 years are headed back to some Palestinian homeland. It's never going to happen. They are effectively Jordanians at this point, and that's fine. And most of them have been pretty much integrated into Jordanian society. And there's all sorts of reasons why historically that wasn't nearly as difficult as people thought it was going to be. And then we have the examples in Europe of very good integration programs, and I would say Canada too, not so much the United States, and there's reasons for that, of people from abroad coming to the country and then being integrated, because you have a definite program of integration. And I don't know that Turkey has that yet. Yeah, as you mentioned, the low-paying wage job issue. It's so it's quite familiar for anyone in the United States to hear these complaints by Turks about the flood of immigrants, the flood of refugees who are taking jobs away from our citizens. Gee, I think I've heard those
Yeah.
in the United States for quite some time now.
Yeah, I think there are differences. In the Canadian immigration world, uh, immigrants are handpicked. There are family reunification categories and so forth, but,
Right.
but we're able to choose our immigrants. They actually want to come here. They're excited. They want to be part of this national fabric that we have, and the people that are here, by and large, are ready to accept them and help them integrate. And God knows we've got so many groups in this country that work hard to integrate private citizens and so forth, and groups who work hard to integrate refugees. In the case of Turkey, there's no selection process. They just have to take everybody, in regardless of circumstances. There are no criminal record checks on the borders and all of this. And so all of these people come in. Turkey is a wealthy country, but not as wealthy as many. And so this becomes a huge burden. And there's an expectation, of course, since they're very close to Syria, that well, there was always an expectation that the conflict would end soon and people would go home. And you get into this cycle where you keep hoping that maybe next year, maybe next year, maybe next year. And so then 10 years have gone past, and it then becomes incumbent on the Turkish government. And I know they've been making moves towards this, but it's sometimes unpopular, to say, these young children that are going to school, who are now learning Turkish, we've got them in our school system. They are now part of our country, and we will just become, we are already a multicultural country in Turkey, but we will now absorb these people, and they will become Turks, and this is how we will proceed in the future, and it'll make us stronger in the end, Right. And I just think in the short term, of course, when you are struggling with a number of issues in your country, that laying out some big grandiose integration program is challenging for anybody. Yeah. And they'll get through this, but I think there has to be some realization that, as you say, these folks are there to stay. In fact, they probably are quite happy to be in Turkey. It's a democracy. Right? I mean, let's not forget this. Right. Turkey may have a lot of issues when we use the term democracy. And I'm sure somebody from Freedom House was to join us right now, they would tell us this. But when you look in the region, at the alternatives are what? Iran, Syria, what we see in Lebanon, what we see in Iraq with the instability there. Even Azerbaijan is as far away from a democracy as you could possibly want. Yet, Turkey, warts and all, is a democracy. And for many people in the region, that's why it's also attractive to be there, because there are freedoms that they don't enjoy when they're at home. There are possibilities and so forth. So, we have to bear that in mind as well.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, is that as imperfect a democracy as Turkey is, it still remains a democracy. And even though, people talk about, is Erdogan an autocrat, or is he a wannabe autocrat? I mean, and I heard the same thing about Donald Trump. Was he an autocrat or a wannabe autocrat? As far as I know, he never, no one was ever able to document a time when he committed what's called premeditated lawlessness. An incident of which we just had with the current administration, but I'll leave that for the audience to try to figure out what I'm referring to. Yeah. So, but the point is that Turkey is an imperfect democracy. I'm still trying to find the perfect democracy to compare it to, because there isn't one. All democracies have flaws, and sometimes they're systemic, and sometimes they have to do with the structures of the democracy. Sometimes they just have to do with personalities. There's all sorts of things. But one of the things I always like to go back to and remind people was, regardless of whether he was intended to be an autocrat or not, when President Erdogan tried to force which is what I think he was trying to do, in the municipal elections for both Istanbul and Ankara, he tried to overturn those results. And he did force a rerunning of the elections. But the electorate and the election workers said no.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, what happened was those candidates who had come first in the initial running of the election did much better in the rerunning.
Yeah.
Because the Turkish people said, no, 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 you are not going to take away our democracy. So I think you're absolutely right when you say that whether they are Syrian refugees or Iraqi refugees or Iranian refugees who are there in large numbers. There are at least 1 million Iranian refugees in Turkey that don't get a lot of attention. And who knows how many Afghan refugees they're going to get soon. Yes, one of the reasons they want to be in Turkey is that, okay, maybe they don't have all the press freedom that Freedom House would ask for, and they don't have the protection of journalists that PEN, P-E-N, would ask for. And rightly so. I think both Freedom House and PEN would be correct to say that press freedom and protection of journalists is not anywhere near what it should be in Turkey, but
yeah,
that just underlines the point that the democracy is imperfect, but it still is there.
I think given the circumstances in the region, the real shocker should be that Turkey even has any vestiges of democracy because of the way it is. I mean, people forget that because they just love pointing fingers at Turkey and saying you should be doing this and you should be doing that. But when it comes to democracy, though, the record has been, we know we've had issues and we continue to have issues there. And I think the government has had two frightening experiences in the recent past. The first was the June 2015 elections when they lost their majority. That was a really frightening moment for the ACT party, and it caused them to go down a route that we are all, aware of in terms of creating a situation in the southeast. And then, of course, the municipal elections, as you mentioned, in Istanbul, which was not only frightening but a massive shock. And I think it's led to it's led to this desire to shut down the Kurdish HDP party. It's led to, if you're with the EA party or the CHP and you're on the hustings trying to talk about the issues, you're getting mobbed by groups of ACT party supporters. And so this will probably pick up as we approach 2023. This is the ugly side of Turkish politics. It's not new, but we are going to see more of it. And it speaks to, the life and death issues that revolve around this country and internally and have been since it formed in 1923. This is the reality. We all would like to see a Turkey that is not divided along Kurdish and Turkish lines, that is able to move along economically and be a regional leader, not have troops deployed all over the place. And of course, that speaks to the wider issues in the region. But look, I mean, you and I both know the region fairly well, and we'll probably be talking and having podcasts in 50 years from now, if we live that long, and we'll be talking about similar issues.
Well, but the fortunate thing is if in 50 years, either one of us is alive or both of us are alive, the podcast will just be like beamed from the device on top of our head or that has been implanted. Anyway, with that, I want to say thanks again. One of the things, unfortunately, is that there's about 1,700 issues of Turkey that we didn't get to, but that means, fortunately, we're going to have you back in a few more weeks and talk further about these. I just wanted to throw in one thing about, again, was it yesterday or today? There was, I know who it was, Robert Gates, former U.S. Defense Secretary, also had another, I think he was the CIA director at one time. yesterday or today in the press was calling upon the Biden administration to get tough with Turkey. I don't know what he means by get tough with Turkey. I'm going to have to look into that. And we'll see. I think Bob Gates was a very effective Secretary of Defense. He was one of the few people who was able to transition from the Republican administration of George Bush to the Obama administration. It's stayed on, helped in that transition and all that, but I've never found it really helpful for the different Washington voices that come out and pound the table and say, get tough with Turkey.
It doesn't really help. And the folks that do say that usually don't really have, in my experience, a good understanding of what are the underlying conditions. And getting tough with Turkey could just make things even worse. Well, and there are more nuanced ways to dealing with these issues. But I mean, look, I watched a Designated Survivor episode the other day. I'm behind the times. I'm catching up, and it was all revolving around the Turkish prime minister in Washington, trying to do an end run around Washington, and President Kirkman had to get tough with Turkey and lay down the law. It actually,
Bob Gates saw that same episode.
Look, it spoke to the issues of the time, and I think how Turkey was frustrating the United States, and it played out in an actual episode of Designated Survivor. I think sometimes that's how many in Washington feel about Turkey, that they need to really take a verbal tough line with them and get them in a box, and enough trouble from, I don't want any more trouble from you, but anybody that even wants to consider that is going down the wrong path, for sure.
So, okay, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Again, this is Dr. Chris Kilford, retired from the Canadian Defence Forces, former Defence Attache in Ankara, and credited to a number of the other areas. I must add this: he is the president or chairman? President.
I'm the Victoria branch president of the Canadian International Council, and I'm on our national board as well.
I would certainly endorse you all to, if you're listening to this, to go and Google the Canadian International Council. I have found that they produce a lot of very helpful and interesting articles about foreign policy from a perspective that unfortunately many of us in the United States don't often get. So again, it's CIC, Canadian International Council. It has a number of branches, and Dr. Kilford is the president of the Victoria, British Columbia branch.
And we have 400 members out here in Victoria.
All right, very good. Okay, take care.
All right.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.